Hello and welcome to another Richard Hunter interview where I sit down with guests who know the city best to talk about the trends, triumphs and turmoil that affect your investments. In this episode I'm delighted to be joined today by Paul Murphy, Investigations Editor of the Financial Times. Paul joined the FT as an associate editor in 2006, first setting up FT Alphaville, the paper's financial blog. In 2018 he took over the role of Head of Investigation. He was previously financial editor at The Guardian and a reporter at the Daily Telegraph. One of Paul's most notable successes was his involvement in the expose of Wirecard, a company regarded by some, at the time, as Europe's answer to PayPal. The story subsequently became the subject of a Netflix documentary called Scandal, Bringing Down Wirecard, which incidentally is well worth a watch. So welcome, Paul, and thank you very much indeed
thank you.
For joining us. Quite the CV. Perhaps we could start with Wirecard, a quite interesting story of subterfuge and scandal. The story was uncovered by your colleague Dan McCrum, with you becoming increasingly involved directly as the editor. Could you briefly summarise the background of Wirecard for us?
Sure, yes. I mean, Dan, my colleague Dan McCrum, he alighted on Wirecard as a potential fraud all the way back in 2014. But it was an accounting story, all right? And accounting stories are actually very difficult to tell through a newspaper format because we have to kind of, when we're writing, we have to be understood by a very broad readership. Most people don't understand accounting. So I became involved with Dan early on, helping him, get this story out. And we basically started with a series of blog posts asking questions about Wirecard's business model that were published on FT Alphaville. And it was the company's response to those early articles which told us that something was deeply amiss here, that we had to dig deeper. And to be frank, in Dan's case, it became an obsession of his. And I was just working with him as his editor, basically helping him get this story out. That's how it initially started. It then snowballed around in the autumn of 2018. You're right, Dan had already written about maybe 30 or 40 different articles on this company. But suddenly in the autumn of 2018, we got word that we had a whistleblower in Singapore. We put Dan on a plane immediately, and he came back with the equivalent of an actual truckload of documentation. I mean, it's actually 80 gigabytes of internal documents from Wirecard. We put Dan in a separate room, working on a so-called air-gapped computer so that he could not be hacked. And he spent several weeks actually going through that material. And at the end of those kind of 6 or 7 weeks, we knew for sure that this was a criminal enterprise. And it was then just a matter of how we took it down.
Wow. And it's true to say that during the course of the investigations, you faced hacking, sting operations and criminal complaints after breaking the story.
It was quite an extraordinary situation, actually, because, yes, kind of Wirecard threw everything at us. There were legal attacks. We were kind of followed. We had kind of huge amounts of kind of online abuse. But what was bizarre from our perspective is that we were putting evidence in front of the readers that this was a fraud, okay? And nobody in the German establishment, including the German media, believed us. They believed the Wirecard story, which was that the idea that this was all fabricated evidence and that we were working in cahoots with short sellers and somehow being kind of compensated for this. It was quite bizarre because, we were kind of looking at, other big, well-established German newspapers like Handelsblatt, thinking, hang on, you must know the culture and the processes that a newspaper like the FT has. We don't publish material like this lightly. there are all sorts of checks and balances and legal checks and, editors. And in this case, the Wirecard stories, which were so powerful and so, heavy, they were being line edited by the editor at that time, Lionel Barber. And, the idea that this was all just made up, that Dan McCrum was being kind of left to go wild writing this stuff, was kind of quite bizarre from our perspective.
Obviously, Wirecard had quite an impact externally. Was there much of an impact culturally, for example, internally at the Financial Times as this story was breaking?
Very much so. It's had the effect of kind of encouraging reporters across the FT newsroom to be more combative in their reporting. And that's really quite significant for the FT, which as an institution, whatever, it's kind of, it's about 130 years old, and its history is very much as a journal of record focused on the City of London. That's its origins. And historically, it had always been very cautious about basically criticising institutions and individuals. It was wary of combative journalism. It saw itself as a journal of record. And that's changed progressively, I guess, over the past decade. The previous editor, Lionel Barber, as he got deeper and deeper into his editorship, he was ready to take on more risk, essentially. And under Rula Khalif, the new editor, we've had to do it because that's the nature of the story, that's the nature of the world. The kind of it's certainly the case that the Ukraine war has accelerated that because it's needed. We've needed to put our reporters in, on the front line in quite dangerous places. And, a lot of work has been done in the background on, say, Russian sanctions, on oligarchs, on sanctions evasion, on the whole commodity space, how things are moving there. And it's needed the FT to be much more kind of agile and, dare I say it, more aggressive. There's also, kind of, if you go back, say, 10 or 15 years ago, people used to say that investigative journalism was dead, that it was just too expensive for newspapers to pursue. And it is expensive, It's, I have, members of my team will often spend 3, 6, 9 months looking at something. And, the costs rack up. But two things have happened. One, there's a blatant understanding amongst, kind of newspaper owners, and this is not just about the FT, it's the same for the New York Times, the Guardian, Sunday Times, whoever, that if you're going to charge subscriptions and quite high prices, then you have to deliver real visible value. And if you go and look at, say, an FT long-form investigative piece, and you go and read the comments at the bottom of that story, you'll see loads of people saying, thank you, this is why I subscribe to the FT, okay? Now, do the economics of that match up? I don't know. That's above my pay grade. But the other factor I'd mention is that you have, over recent years, you've had this new breed of young reporter coming into the media industry. Even though the kind of pay is terrible, they still want to be journalists, and they tend to be much more kind of driven, and they actually want to change things. And so my team at the FT, we have a queue of youngsters across the newsroom who want to get on that team, or actually just want to do that sort of journalism. And so my job actually ends up as kind of wearing two hats. I work with my direct team, about 6 or 7 of us, and quite separately I do a kind of like outreach work, which is across the newsroom when people are doing deeper reporting and it's tougher reporting and it has kind of legal problems or privacy problems. I work with them directly to support them. And that works quite seamlessly at a place like the FT, which is, it's a very kind of collegiate culture. It's quite different from, I used to work at The Guardian, and before that The Telegraph, and those were very different places. Yeah. Much more kind of Fleet Streety, kind of quite vicious politics, and that. The FT is different. It's it very much sees itself as a global newspaper, and the culture is quite bookish, and so we have the investigative team have a good relationship with the rest of the newsroom. We're not hidden away in some bunker. We sit in the main newsroom and we talk to everybody else.
Sure, and indeed another story you uncovered, which caused quite a stir at the time, was the President's Club affair. Could you remind us what was going on there?
Yes, that's okay. So the background to the President's Club is that I'd been given this job as head of investigations, and I was abroad on holiday in Africa, sitting there thinking, how the hell am I going to do this job? And this woman rang me up, from the newsroom, that I hadn't spoken to before, a woman called Madison Marriage. And she said that she had this story and she was struggling to get any traction with it from any of the news desks at the FT, because people were saying that this was not an FT story, and she thought it was. And I said, well, what's the story? And she said, well, for the past 30 years, there's been a secret dinner held at the Dorchester each year, where 300 men from finance, property and advertising are serviced by 160 hostesses in skimpy dresses. And apparently there is a lot of very bad behaviour that happens. And I said, what? This has been happening for 30 years. And I thought for a moment, I've been a journalist for 30 years, I'm a city journalist for 30 years, I don't know about this. I said, this is bloody dynamite, Madison. I said, of course it's a story. But to do the story, it meant that we had to put Madison undercover. She had to go in she had to go in as a hostess. She had to get herself hired for that event. And that was the first time the FT had done actual undercover work. And we had to set up a system where we had eyes on the Dorchester from all angles. We didn't know who was going to be at that dinner. And so we had Madison and also another woman undercover as hostesses that were mic'd up with these tiny little microphones that I bought from a guy in Lithuania. We had pinhole cameras on myself and another colleague, Barney. We had a long lens, paparazzi style photographers in Hyde Park. We had an operational centre at the Intercontinental, and we zoomed in on the Dorchester, and we got the details. And but it was a very, very difficult story because we had clear evidence of bad behaviour. This was a classic Me Too story, and getting it through the FT system was tricky. I had to say, you've got to, I was saying to kind of senior editors at the time, you've got to realise how seriously irritated young professional women are that these sorts of events still happen. They're from another era. Stop it. But what we were doing there is that we were, going into a situation we were about to kind of reveal the names of scores of very rich men, all of whom are kind of, lawyered up to the kind of hilt. And that was quite tricky and quite a lot of fun. But we published, and the story went, into orbit for about a couple of weeks that year. It was the only thing people were talking about. And I must say, the postbag at the FT, they hated it. We had a whole series of new readers who said, brilliant, and thank goodness that the FT have done this. And I had women across the newsroom coming up to me saying, thank you for helping Madison get this story over the line. But a lot of our older male readers hated us for it and said this is the end of the FT, but we're still here.
And the President's Club dinner?
Well, it's gone. It disappeared. Lots of people said, "Oh, it's terrible. You've destroyed this charity." No, this was a boys' big night out with a small charity attached, and we could never print the absolute detail of what was happening at that night. But trust me on that. Read between the lines.
Yeah.
The behaviour was unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable, Yeah, it's gone.
Paul, it's been a pleasure to hear from you, so many thanks again for your time. And thank you for watching. To make sure you don't miss part 2 of my interview with Paul, subscribe to the Interactive Investor YouTube channel for free by selecting the subscribe button. And as ever, you can find more investment ideas and insight at ii.co.uk. Bye for now.